Hi everyone, welcome to OCBC Research Insights. So since our first episode of the OCBC Treasury House View, lots of things has happened, including the US regional banking crisis. So today we want to take this opportunity to update you with our latest house view. So together with me, we have our chief economist, Selina Ling, our rates strategist, Francis Chong, and our FX analyst, Chris Wang. Hi Selina, given the recent US regional banking crisis, do you see the higher risk of the US recession?
Actually, the US recession risk really never went away. You have to remember, that because of the aggressive monetary policy tightening by the Fed, actually we are expecting growth to slow down. So it's a question of whether we get a technical recession in the second half of this year, but we are not really expecting a full year contraction for 2023. There are quite a few headwinds. The monetary policy tightening is one. So while the Fed has signaled that it's ready to pause, it's not quite ready to cut rates yet. So while inflation has been cooling, essentially the job market still remains relatively tight. And in fact, we've had a very, very uneven growth momentum. The manufacturing PMI is in contraction territory for 6 months running, but the services PMI remains in expansion territory. So the recent regional bank failures, I think, will imply that credit conditions will tighten from here, and that will weigh on the US economy. Going out ahead, I think it is quite clear that there will be some form of a slowdown. It's just a question of whether we get a shallow and temporary slowdown, or we actually get a more protracted and prolonged type of slowdown story. I think for now, our base case scenario is that the Fed will probably, rule monetary policy with a lighter hand, meaning that while they're not ready to cut, but hopefully they don't tighten any further from here. And if so, I think that will give markets a little bit of breathing space.
So what do you see the impact of the US slowdown on the regional economies?
We have to remember, actually, it's not just a growth slowdown in the US economy. Actually, the other major economies like Europe and also to a certain extent, China also is not picking up speed fast enough. So this external demand slowdown story is going to have a significant impact on the Asian economies. So if you look at the manufacturing PMIs for this region in ASEAN, they have seen modest improvements in April, but generally we see that the North Asian ones for South Korea and Taiwan, they still remain in contraction territory. So this very mixed picture, I think, is a reflection of the external demand slowing down, but also the challenges that we're currently facing with the semiconductor industry downturn. So while we are hopeful that there will be some stabilization in the semiconductor industry in the second half of this year, if for any reason it gets pushed out to early 2024, then actually it means that the growth recovery story in the second half may not materialize. So while ASEAN is expected to see a relatively resilient growth this year, I think a lot will now turn to the services sector. With China's reopening, there has been great hopes these bigger waves of Chinese tourists will come back and lift the hospitality sector. But so far, the data up to March suggests that actually both the tourism arrivals and hotel occupancy rates are not quite back to pre-COVID levels yet. In fact, what has been carrying the improvement is actually other nationalities outside of China. But that said, of course, we are hopeful that, going ahead into the second half of this year, once flight capacity picks up, Chinese tourists are more comfortable with traveling overseas, then that could actually be a positive factor for the regional economies.
Okay, let me bring Francis into the discussion as well. So now the higher for longer is no longer the theme. In fact, the market has already pricing the Fed rate cuts quite aggressively. So do you agree with this assessment?
Yeah, Tommy, indeed, the expectation that the Fed is more or less done with interest rate hike, what is driving the market is the expectations about rate cuts. So whenever market adds to its rate cut expectations, we will see Treasury yields, especially the short-end yields fall, and vice versa. So the market is currently pricing in around 3 rate cuts, 25 pp each by the end of this year. But our base case is for the Fed easing cycle to start in early 2024. So comparing the two, we do see the market pricing as a bit overly dovish. The risk is there for the easing cycle to start slightly sooner than our base case, pretty much depending on the data. And on the data front, we do watch out for the US CPI, especially the base effect. There is an increasingly high base effect for the coming months, especially around the June to July period. This should be a well-noted factor in advance, which in theory should not affect the Fed's reaction function. However, when the actual outcome really materializes, let's say if we do see a low print of CPI in June, how the market react to that remains to be seen. And likewise, the FOMC itself has been expecting CPI headline to fall or to decelerate rapidly. However, again, how the committee will communicate on this actual outcome will again affect the market pricing of rate cuts. On balance, at this juncture, we do feel the market pricing of around cumulatively 75 or 80 pp kind of rate cuts is overly dovish.
Thanks, Francis. Chris, so as mentioned by Francis, the global central banks, including the Fed, are near the end of this tightening cycle. So does this change your assessment on the US dollar?
I think you are right. Most of the central banks are near the end of their respective tightening cycles. For instance, if you look at the Fed, it has potentially set a stage to pause its policy tightening cycle, but data dependence is still key. If you look at the recent US CPI data, it kind of reinforced the disinflation trend and adds the conviction that a pause could be coming as early as at the next June FOMC. So the question is that there is this wide disconnect between markets and the Fed in terms of the timing of rate cut and also in terms of the size of cut. Assuming if markets were to eventually correct or adjust their dovish expectations and to realign themselves with the Fed, then that could still pose some upward pressure on the dollar. As we argue that with Fed nearing the end of its tightening cycle, then the dollar upside could also be limited in this space. So our bias or our house view for a moderate to soft dollar profile still stands.
In this environment, so what are the currencies may potentially benefit from that?
With a Fed pause, there are some interesting currencies to consider. For instance, the IDR, the Indonesian rupiah, it can benefit in this environment for its carry. We have a Goldilocks-like environment where growth is not overheating, it's not also tanking. At the same time, inflation around the world is peaking, and rates around the world in terms of monetary tightening is also near the respective end of the cycle. The other currency that would be attractive is also Thai baht. So you got a soft dollar profile, and you also have benefits of a potential China reopening that can benefit Thailand inbound tourism. In terms of softer oil prices, that can also typically benefit net oil importer countries like Thailand. North Asian currencies in particular, like Korean won, Taiwan dollar, renminbi itself, they still underperform to some extent. That's very much due to what's going on with the sluggish external demand, the tech down cycle, and also to do with a bit of US-China geopolitical tensions. Some of these need to improve, in particular the tech down cycle and the external demand environment, in order for some of these currencies to play catch up in terms of their performance. Other areas, for instance, you might want to consider would be yen and gold. They could potentially benefit to some extent if there is any risk of or any intensification of a growth slowdown.
Thanks a lot for all the updates. So that's the end of our episode 2 OCBC Treasury House View. Thanks for watching.